So the story lately has just been massive cold fronts. I mean, it's been a crazy May. We had 85, even felt like we maybe even got up to 90 degrees and really strong winds. It was hot and windy early May. And goodness, I remember water temperatures climbing up, you know, high 50s, low 60s here in North Dakota. Went from one of the hottest Mays I could remember to all of a sudden it's like flipping a switch. The following week, water temperatures crash. We get this massive cold front. We go from like 85 degrees down to 35 degrees. Massive cold front. It's, you know, big system that cuts across the upper Midwest. Not only do we have a change in temperature, we had a lot of rain, you know, 5-6 inches of rain in some places across western North Dakota, a few more inches a couple days later. And so during this big cold front, you know, one of the things that we did just to reflect or to back up a little bit, run over to Lake Sakakawea one day, just because we could see the forecast wasn't looking good, but there was one day, one window where we're going to get a little bit of rain in the morning and then maybe, you know, a chance of rain in the afternoon, but most of the day looked like it was going to be pretty clear with, you know, moderate strong winds. Thought, well, we can deal with that. I want to just get over there because I've been hearing about this hot bite on Lake Sakakawea, you know, up in the upper end of the reservoir from Newtown, White Earth, Lund's Landing. You look at that stretch of the reservoir during the month of May, and it's a it's a pretty good place to be. A lot of these fish in that reservoir push upriver, upstream, up current, up in the upper end of Lake Sakakawea, spawn, and then come back down. And so I've been hearing some fantastic reports from that end of the reservoir. And so we made the run, and we get out, and a lot of the prior reports were fish in 4 to maybe 8-9 feet of water. We get out there, and obviously big cold front, water temperature drops several degrees, and I guess it's probably pretty typical, but you know, we're seeing fish in maybe 9 to 16 feet of water. And we're finding quite a few fish, you know, in classic shoreline structure where you'd expect them to be in 9 to 16 feet of water. Fish that, you know, on the electronics look like walleyes, and, you know, tried some different presentations that honestly didn't work. I wanted to catch fish on a drop shot, so I tried that. Couldn't even get the fish to move on it. Then I tried jigging a plastic. I get the fish to maybe track it a little ways or follow it, and then fish just weren't interested in it. I went to a jig and a minnow. Still nothing. You know, I mean, I get the fish to look, and that was about it. And so finally, just out of desperation, broke out live bait rig or a Lindy rig, which, you know, I mean, if you do a lot of walleye fishing, Lindy rigs, live bait rigs, they've caught a lot of fish, and they continue to catch fish, and it's kind of the last line of defense when a lot of things aren't working. You know, that's what a lot of times we go back to catch fish. And so to me, you know, on tough bite situations, there's a couple things that stand out to me. You know, something like a slip bobber and a leech, or a Lindy rig with some type of live bait. And so we end up doing that. And I've seen this before, but mostly in the fall, where for whatever reason you try casting at fish, and it's just for whatever reason they don't like it. But if you drag through them with either bait or something, you know, those fish will respawn. And so we started doing that. Still using the forward-facing sonar. We'd scan around, look for a pack of fish, and then we would just scoot up to it and just drag live bait rigs through those fish. Well, lo and behold, you know, we go from not getting any bites, not catching anything, to all of a sudden we're starting to get bites, we start to catch fish, we start to kind of put it together. And then it starts to, you know, start dealing with a bunch of pouring rain. I mean, the rain just started, I mean, it was brutal. And luckily, you know, we had the right gear, but it was just a brutal day where we ended up putting all of our camera gear away and just, you know, we kept on fishing just because we're still mad at them. But, you know, I think it's worth talking or worth discussing because, you know, we learned something that day. Maybe we relearned a few things that day, but I thought it was, you know, interesting where, you know, something to communicate is that, you know, all the tackle, all the equipment, all the things that you can use to catch fish, when you're down to your bayonet, a plain hook and good live bait is going to save you. And so that's definitely what happened, you know, in Sakakawea here recently. But, you know, you look at live bait rigs, you know, there's a couple things that really stand out to me, you know, things that I've, you know, learned over the years, or, you know, have been taught to me, or I've seen other people do with success and I've incorporated into my own fishing. But there's definitely nuances, definitely an art to live bait rigging, just like anything else. So here's some tips regarding live bait rigs or Lindy rigs, whatever you want to call it, that I think are really important. Tip number one, you know, we'll just start off with the rod, the line, just the basic setup. As a rule of thumb, you know, we're using longer rods. I would say a 7 to a 7.5 foot, medium light, fast to extra fast tip rod is perfect. And to me, live bait rigging is kind of like jigging in the sense if you're going to have a more premium, sensitive, high quality rod, you're going to probably want jigging rods and your live bait rigging rods to, have that better graphite. So just a Shields Outfitter 1 limited edition. We'll put links for all this stuff here in the description. And also too, don't be afraid to chime in the comments, as far as what you like. I mean, we're always trying to learn stuff too. And over time, some of the things that we do evolves as well. And so we're always interested to see what other opinions are. But 7 to 7.5 foot rod, medium light, just a little bit of a soft tip, but you need that backbone for a sweeping hook set. Now, why the longer rod? In a lot of cases, we are using longer snells. Sometimes you might have to use a long snell on a place like, say, Mille Lacs out on the mud, because when your weight is hitting the bottom, you're puffing up sediment and you need to get that bait away from your weight. Other times, for whatever reason, maybe there's times where the fish are attracted to the weight, maybe there's times where the fish are spooked to the weight. There used to be a thought that the longer the snell, the higher up off the bottom your bait would get, but I find that, maybe to a point you get the bait up a little bit off the bottom, especially if you can kick your boat speed up a little bit, but as a rule of thumb, you're pretty close to the bottom if you're going at really slow speeds, regardless of length of snell. But from an efficiency standpoint, I recommend just having a 6-7 foot snell, just something that you can hook on your handle without having to double your snell back around your reel and hooking it on your guide, which is what we often have to do if you're using a longer snell. I feel like your efficiency is way better if you can use the shortest snell possible. If you can use a 6 foot snell, you're going to miss way fewer fish than if you have to use a 10 or 12 foot snell. Okay, so I don't use those extra long snells unless I have to. But I like to start off with a 6 or 7 foot snell, just because over the course of the day, you're going to catch fish that swallow the hook, or you got to get in with your pliers, you're going to nick up your line, you're going to catch pike. There's just different things that happen where you have to retie this line. And so for on the business end, as far as the snell itself, I recommend using monofilament just because fluorocarbon sinks, okay? And a lot of times, again, if there's a standard, I guess, it depends on the area, depends on the body of water, but I'll use an 8-pound snell quite a bit if I can. If I can get away with it, I'll even use a 10-pound snell if I have to speed up distances between fish, because I feel like the snell twists up less. But on a real finesse bite where I have to really slow down and roll up my sleeves and, just fish for fish that are tough, 6-pound test is probably the norm. As far as on the spool itself, again, either 6 or 8 pound monofilament. Now, I'm a big fan of spooling up straight mono for this reason. When I'm using live bait rigs, that fish grabs onto the crawler, grabs onto the minnow, and grab onto it and just hold it, okay? And a lot of times they don't get the whole thing. They just get a part of it, a piece of it. And then what they do is like they take another gulp and then they suck it in further. And that stretch of monofilament seems to facilitate that with live bait rigging, okay? Fish hits that minnow, head or the tail is still sticking out. Usually they hit the head of the minnow, tail still sticking out, they suck it in again. They can keep pulling that bait inside their mouth where they can really get it, and then you feel the fish, you start to feel a little bit of movement, the fish runs a little bit, and then you can crack the fish, okay? And so monofilament, I feel, gives me an edge. I use jigs and mono a lot with live bait, and with the rigging with live bait, I like to use monofilament a lot. So a good sensitive graphite rod with a high carbon count, 7 to 7 foot medium light, 6 to 8 pound monofilament. And then as far as the weight itself, I mean, you can use just a lead egg sinker if you're dealing with a lot of snags. You can use the classic walking sinkers. I've really fallen in love with these tungsten cylinder weights from Northland Fishing Tackle, just because that wider surface on the front, it just seems to crawl through everything. I find that they don't get wedged up in rocks as much. And so, like on Sakakawea, we're fishing on rocks, fishing on boulders. I think I lost one weight all day long. They just tumble through stuff really good. And so, cylinder weights to be where it's at. And then usually I'm putting just a small bead above my swivel just to protect my knot and to keep that weight from sliding down to the swivel. And then you're just using your small barrel swivel, and then going right down. In a lot of cases, a plain hook. If I'm using minnows, I might use a size 4 octopus hook. Night crawlers, maybe a size 6. Leeches, maybe a size 6 or smaller. And sometimes I'll just put a plain bead in front of that single hook. And as far as colored hooks, I mean, that's something I play around with. My big thing is I want a sharp hook. I mean, some of these premium hooks, for example, if they even see a rock, they fold over, okay? And so, you got to really take care of your hooks, have a hook file on the boat, swap out your hooks when they get nicked up on rock. But biggest thing for me is I want the sharpest hook in my tackle box. A lot of times I don't care what color it is. I've seen where red can be a difference or orange can make a difference, but I try not to get too consumed with that, at least when I'm trying to figure out the day. The other thing I like to do, if there's a lot of slime or debris on the bottom, is use these gumdrop floaters on the end instead of a plain hook. Okay. Reason I like the gumdrop floater versus just putting a float on your line is that when you pull through the water, it just has a wobble. I find that with leeches especially, half a crawler, a minnow, it just gets this side-to-side action going that really seems to trigger fish. And so those are the two setups. Slime, algae, a little bit of low weed growth on the bottom, gumdrop floater, clean bottoms. A lot of times I'm running a plain hook. Now here's something to consider when you're pulling live bait rigs. You can just drag that live bait, and that live bait is kind of doing the work for you in the sense that that leech might be swimming, that night crawler might be squirming a little bit. You've got a minnow fighting against the hook. That alone is going to trigger fish, but I find that I catch more fish if I just do a little bit with a rod tip, where I'm talking like a 6-inch to maybe a 15-inch, just a little bit of a hitch in that general presentation where I'm just popping it forward 5 inches, popping it forward a foot, and then letting it sit, popping it, letting it sit. Almost like a jigging motion where, what you do with a jig, a lot of times I like to do with that live bait rig. You cause that weight to push ahead, and then that bait gets pulled ahead and then stops, pulled and stops. And I find then that triggers a lot of fish. Besides doing that with the rod that I'm holding in my hand, I'm also doing that to some extent with the boat, in the sense that there's times where I'll use bottom bouncers, for example, and just go one continuous speed up a contour. But I find early in the year, especially after fronts, what I like to do is kind of start and stop the boat, where I'll pull the boat ahead 3, 4, 5 feet at maybe 0.6, 0.7, 0.8 miles an hour, and then slow down and stop. Speed up and slow down and stop. Speed up, and you're just kind of creeping up over structure and along contours. You combine that with a little bit of a variation on the rod tip, and I feel like on tough bites, that can account for a lot more fish. The next tip I'm going to share with you is with live bait rigging, in a lot of cases, you're only as good as your bait, okay? If you have good bait, you're going to be a way better live bait rigger. I mean, that's just the facts. And so leeches, a lot of times when I'm out fishing, what I like to do with leeches is run them in the live well so that they're the same temperature as the water in the lake, so that way there's no shock. And just run a lot of water on them. Even if it's warm out, I find that leeches do really well. There's mesh bags they sell that you can put leeches in, but run water through them continuously. And unless it's really, really hot in the middle of summertime, I find that it seems like the leeches are way more active when you put them on the hook versus if they're in really cold water and then they come in to get submerged in the water that's, say, 15 to 20 degrees warmer when you put them in the lake. A lot of times that can almost put the leech in shock, where just doesn't work well. With minnows, you start off with good minnows, okay? If you want the best minnows, I think you're gonna have to probably trap them or net them yourself. That's probably a reality, but there's some bait shops, for example, that just sell more bait, that just have better distribution, better suppliers, where for whatever reason, not all bait shops are the same. Usually the bait shops that are busy, that just go through a lot of bait, usually have the best bait, because those minnows are never in the tank for very long before they're gone. With night crawlers, what I like to do is just soak them overnight in ice water, and they just get really plump. And then when I'm using them on a live bait rig, especially if I'm using a whole crawler, a lot of times I'll just put a little puff of air in that night crawler just to float it up a little bit and add a little bit more buoyancy. As far as taking care of leeches when you're not on the water, obviously we're storing them in refrigerators. Change the water every 2 or 3 days. Use well water, or water that you can collect from a rain gutter. And then also too, I find that if I store them in a styrofoam bucket, they do way better than if they're in anything that's plastic. It's like they can stick to the styrofoam and clean themselves off a lot better. And I don't worry about feeding them anything. I feel like that just dirties up the water. Keep their metabolism low by keeping them refrigerated, and then change the water often. And you can take care of leeches and just make sure that they're in good shape. Now when it comes to actually catching fish on a live bait rig, the tip that I'll offer is just remember that when you've got the rod tip and the weight and then the hook, when that fish grabs onto that hook, if you're just going to set the hook, you're just going to move that weight up and down. Okay, so what I always try to encourage people to do, whether you're slip bobber fishing or live bait rigging, is set the hook with the reel. And a lot of times on a tough bite, we might have the bail open with the finger on the line, where we'll feed that fish a little bit, or even just point the rod tip back, let the fish have a little longer. But on a really good bite, I mean, you can set the hook on the fish right away as soon as you feel the bite. But on a tougher bite, feed the fish line. Now, when you're feeding the fish line, what I like to do is just coast the boat forward so I have a little bit of momentum with the boat and set the hook with the reel. And what that does is, imagine you close your bail and you're reeling. What you're doing is you're just lifting that weight up off the bottom until you have a direct connection from the rod tip to the hook. And what happens is that rod starts to load up, you can start to feel that fish move. And at that point, you can just reel faster to set the hook or just do a sweeping hook set to set the hook. But don't try to necessarily just set the hook like you're using a jig, because all you're going to do is just pop that weight 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet off the bottom, or the fish might be, you know, towards you. You know, the fish don't always run away from you with a live bait rig. And so set the hook with the reel, and I feel like over the course of the year, you're going to catch way more fish with a live bait rig. The last thing I'm going to share with you when it comes to live bait rigging is adjust your presentation to what you see on your electronics. Okay, doesn't matter if you're using 2D sonar or if you're using forward-facing sonar. If you see fish that are letting you come right over the top of them with the boat and they're not spooking or reacting from the presence of the boat, you know what, that's where you want to be. Okay, if you see a fish below the boat on 2D sonar, you want your presentation right below the back of the boat, because that's where the fish is. Okay, and so when you're marking fish right below the boat, I like to fish right below the boat. But if you can see where you're driving up towards fish with forward-facing sonar, for example, and you get within, say, 30, 40, 50 feet, and then they bump off of you where they're reacting to the boat, or you're just getting glimpses of them on your 2D sonar, let out a lot of line and get further behind the boat to catch fish. And typically, if I'm fishing below the boat, I like to use enough weight to keep my line at a 45-degree angle. If you're fishing behind the boat, use much less weight and get back further behind the boat.